And if they wanted to do murder, that was okay
That was
with
none
you?
of my business, woman. I'm a convict. I'm an outlaw. I'm a rebel. I'm not a Sunday school teacher.
I'm not giving you book and movie info. I'm giving you info for investigations and stuff, and that's it.
Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me.
Interviews with serial killers often reveal their true nature. From stone-cold stares to shocking statements, these reactions will surely send a chill down your spine. Prepare for a wild ride as we bring to you the top 10 reactions of serial killers in interviews. Number 1. Charles Manson. Charles Manson was an American cult leader and serial criminal. He was born in 1934 in Ohio to a teenage mother and was raised in several homes. Manson had a troubled childhood, having been in and out of juvenile detention centers and reformatories throughout his teenage years. The majority of his life was spent incarcerated, where he became interested in music and started to form his own cult-like following. Manson's followers were mostly young women who he convinced he was the second coming of Christ. He preached about an impending race war, which he called helter-skelter, and believed that his followers would need to prepare for it by taking the lives of wealthy white people. In August 1969, Manson's followers carried out a series of brutal crimes at the homes of actress Sharon Tate and supermarket executive Leno LaBianca. The horrific crimes shocked the nation, and the incident became known as one of the most infamous series of criminal activities in the United States past. In 1987, Charles Manson was interviewed in San Quentin prison by Charlie Rose. The interview was conducted over several days, and Manson was given the opportunity to speak candidly about his life and crimes. During the interview, Manson spoke about his beliefs and his views on the justice system. He also talked about his followers and the events that led up to the murders. In the interview, Manson portrayed himself as a misunderstood figure who had been unfairly targeted by law enforcement. He had a racist cross on his forehead. When asked about it, Manson gave a rambling and disjointed response. When Rose inquired whether he felt guilty, Manson responded with a resounding no. He felt that he hadn't done anything wrong and had nothing to feel guilty about. However, he did express a sense of shame for not doing enough. Manson believed that he could have done more to give back to society and to be a more perceptive and understanding person. He went to the extent of revealing that he should have taken the lives of 500 people so that he would feel like he had really contributed something to society. The interview was widely interpreted as a sign of Manson's narcissism and his lack of remorse for the crimes he had committed. The media characterized Manson as a monster and a master manipulator who had brainwashed his followers. Number 2. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy is considered one of the most infamous serial killers in the history of the United States. He was born in Burlington, Vermont in 1946 and grew up in a middle-class family. Bundy was a charming and intelligent man with a magnetic personality that helped him blend in seamlessly with his victims and those around him. However, he had a darker side. Bundy's crimes began in the early 1970s when he moved to Washington State to attend law school. In the subsequent years, he ended the lives of a minimum of 30 young women, most of whom were college students. Bundy's victims were typically young, attractive women with long brown hair, and Ted Bundy would use a trick to target these women, which involved him pretending to be injured and wearing a fake cast or sling on his arm. He would often walk with crutches as well. After gaining sympathy from his victims with his apparent disability, Bundy would then use his charm to persuade them to assist him with tasks such as carrying books or unloading items from his car. Bundy's era of fear came to a halt in 1975 after being arrested in Utah for operating a car that was stolen. The police soon discovered that Bundy matched the description of a suspect in several unsolved crimes, and they began to investigate him. Over the next few years, Bundy was linked to dozens of crimes across several states and was ultimately convicted of multiple counts. During his time in prison, Bundy gave several interviews to journalists. In an interview which was conducted in 1977, Bundy discussed his crimes in detail and provided insight into his twisted psyche. Bundy was asked a series of questions about his childhood, his relationships with women, and his motivations for committing his crimes. He responded in a calm and measured tone, often deflecting blame and portraying himself as a victim of circumstance. He laughed and tried to hide his crimes by referring to stealing a comic book when he was 5 years old. He said, "I don't feel guilty for anything I've done. I don't think that what I did was wrong." Despite Bundy's attempts to downplay his crimes and portray himself as a sympathetic figure, law enforcement officials and the media interpreted his words as a chilling admission of guilt. Many saw Bundy's calm demeanor as evidence of his sociopathy and lack of empathy for his victims. The interview also sparked controversy and debate about the role of the media in giving a platform to notorious criminals like Bundy. In the end, Bundy was executed by electrocution in 1989. Number 3. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, who gained the nickname Night Stalker, was a notorious serial criminal who brought terror to Southern California during the mid-1980s. Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. He had a troubled childhood and was exposed to violence and substance abuse at a young age. He moved to California in the 1980s and began a crime spree that lasted over a year. Ramirez took the lives of 13 people and attempted to take 5 more. He often broke into their homes at night, attacking them with a variety of weapons, including guns, knives, and hammers. Ramirez would sometimes leave satanic symbols at the crime scene, which added to the fear and confusion of the public. Ramirez's crime sparked a media frenzy and an intense manhunt by law enforcement. He was finally captured in August 1985 after being recognized by a group of residents who chased and apprehended him. In 1988, Ramirez agreed to do an interview with journalist Mike Watkis from KTVK in Phoenix, Arizona. During the interview, Ramirez talked about his crimes and his motivations. He showed no remorse for his actions and made several shocking statements. During his interviews, Richard Ramirez responded to questions about his motives for crimes with a chilling lack of remorse, often laughing and refusing to comment. He also frequently alluded to his alleged connection to Satan and demonic possession. When asked specifically about his interest in Satanism, Ramirez's response was cryptic, stating that Satanism is undefiable wisdom, suggesting that he believed in the power and influence of the dark forces. These responses only added to the already terrifying persona of Ramirez and contributed to his reputation as a deeply disturbed and dangerous individual. This interview with Ramirez was widely publicized and caused a sensation in the media. Law enforcement officials were disturbed by his lack of remorse and his fascination with Satanism. He spent over 23 years on death row before dying of complications from B-cell lymphoma in 2013. Ramirez was not executed for his crimes, as he died while awaiting execution. His death brought an end to one of the most notorious and terrifying crime sprees in American history. Number 4. Zachary Davis. The story of Zachary Davis is a haunting tale that sheds light on the devastating consequences of mental illness and untreated emotional distress. Born in 1992 in the United States, Zachary Davis was just like any other child until he reached adolescence, when he began to exhibit signs of antisocial behavior and anger management issues. In 2012, Zachary Davis committed an unspeakable crime that left the world in shock. On the night of August 18th, Zachary went to the cinema with his mother and older brother. However, when they returned home, Zachary waited for his mother to fall asleep before he attacked her with a sledgehammer. He hit her repeatedly until she was no longer breathing, and then attempted to set the house on fire with his brother inside. Melanie Davis, Zachary's mother, had been a single parent for 6 years after her husband passed away. She was devoted to her children and had always tried to give them the best life possible. However, Zachary's mental health issues made him resentful of his mother, and he believed that she was not taking care of their family as she should have. Zachary's anger and resentment towards his mother reached a boiling point on that fateful night, leading him to commit an act of unspeakable violence. Zachary's behavior after the crime is even more disturbing than the crime itself. He showed no remorse for his actions and even seemed to take pleasure in recounting the details of the attack. During his interview with Dr. Phil, Zachary spoke in a monotone voice and with a chilling lack of emotion. He calmly explained how he took his mother's life, even describing the sound of the hammer hitting her head with a smirk on his face. Zachary's demeanor and behavior during the interview left Dr. Phil and viewers shocked and disturbed. After a 4-day trial, Zachary Davis was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to life in prison. The case of Zachary Davis is a tragic reminder of the importance of addressing mental health issues and emotional distress in a timely and effective manner. While it may be difficult to predict when someone will snap and commit an act of violence, it is crucial that we recognize the warning signs and intervene before it is too late. In conclusion, Zachary Davis is a harrowing example of the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness and emotional distress. It is important that all necessary steps are taken to address these issues and prevent tragedies like this from happening in the future. Number 5. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, the infamous American serial criminal, is responsible for taking the lives of 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1960, Dahmer had a difficult childhood marked by social withdrawal and sadistic behavior. He was also fascinated with animal dissection, a behavior that later escalated to human dissection. Dahmer committed his first crime in 1978 when he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks and brought him back to his parents' home. He proceeded to bludgeon Hicks with a dumbbell, dismembered his body, and scattered the remains on his family's property. Over the next few years, Dahmer continued to lure young men to his home, where he overpowered and strangled them. He also engaged in necrophilia and cannibalism, often keeping the victims' body parts as souvenirs. In 1993, an interview with Jeffrey Dahmer took place where he described the events leading up to his crimes, his motivations for committing them, and his feelings of remorse. He expressed his fantasy of creating a love slave, someone who would be with him forever. He believed that by taking people's lives and preserving their body parts, he could keep them with him always. Dahmer admitted his mistakes and expressed regret for his actions. He acknowledged that he should have stuck with counseling and talked to someone about his feelings of isolation and loneliness, which he believes was his way of coping. The interview with Dahmer was widely covered by the media, and his statements were analyzed and debated by law enforcement officials and psychologists. Some believed that Dahmer was genuinely remorseful and was seeking to understand his own motivations, while others saw his statements as an attempt to manipulate the public and gain sympathy. Dahmer's crimes and statements have since been the subject of numerous books, films, and documentaries, sparking discussions about the nature of evil, mental illness, and the criminal justice system. Despite the debate surrounding Dahmer's statements, it is clear that his crimes had a devastating impact on the families and loved ones of his victims. His actions were heinous and deeply disturbing, and they remain a stark reminder of the capacity for evil within human beings. Number 6. Robert Fratta. Robert Fratta was a former police officer and convicted felon from Houston, Texas. He was born in July 1954. The disgraced officer was deemed more of a psychopathic criminal than a serial one. He completed his studies at Texas A&M University and worked as a police officer in Missouri City, Texas. In 1991, Fratta's wife, Farah Fratta, was shot in the driveway of their home. The investigation revealed that Robert had conspired with his lover, a former exotic dancer named Sandra Bridewell, and 2 other men to carry out the crime. The motive behind the crime was a custody battle between Fratta and his wife over their 3 children. Fratta and Bridewell were both arrested and charged with capital death in 1994. In 1996, Fratta was convicted and sentenced to death, while Bridewell received a life sentence. The 2 other men involved in the crime were also given sentences. In 2001, Fratta was interviewed by a reporter from the Houston Chronicle while on death row. During the interview, Fratta claimed that he was innocent and that he had been wrongly convicted. He also denied any involvement, stating that he loved her and would never have hurt her. Fratta's interview was widely interpreted by law enforcement and the media as an attempt to manipulate public opinion in his favor. The prosecution team argued that Fratta's statements were self-serving and designed to elicit sympathy from the public. The media also portrayed Fratta as a cold, calculating criminal who had manipulated his lover and others to carry out his sinister plan. In another interview, Fratta admitted that he was not attracted to his wife, Farah, but loved the work she did for him. He showed no emotion and continued with his lies, saying he thought it was a drug raid. Despite his claims of innocence, Fratta's guilt was established through the testimony of his co-conspirators and other evidence presented at his trial. Fratta died in January 2023 while still on death row. Fratta's case highlights the potential for corruption within law enforcement and the justice system, as well as the complex and often volatile nature of personal relationships. The manipulation of others for personal gain, as well as the willingness to engage in violence, are common themes in cases involving psychopathic killers, such as Fratta. The case also underscores the importance of a fair and impartial justice system, one that is not swayed by public opinion or media attention. Despite Fratta's attempts to sway public opinion in his favor, the evidence against him was strong enough to secure his conviction. Number 7. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was a notorious American serial criminal who was active in Florida in the late 1980s and early 1990s. She was convicted of taking the lives of 7 men and was executed by lethal injection in 2002. Wuornos had a troubled upbringing. She had a history of violent behavior and was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Wuornos's spree began in 1989 and continued until 1990. She targeted middle-aged men, most of whom she met while working as a street worker. Wuornos would shoot her victims at point-blank range and then rob them. She was eventually caught and confessed to taking people's lives as well, claiming that all her crimes were committed in self-defense. Wuornos's case received widespread media attention, in part because she was one of the few female serial killers in U.S. history. Her troubled past and status as a street worker also made her a controversial figure. Wuornos's case inspired a number of films, including the critically acclaimed Monster, which starred Charlize Theron as Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos's last interview was conducted by Nick Broomfield, a documentary filmmaker, on October 8, 2002, just hours before her execution. Wuornos had been convicted of taking the lives of 7 men between 1989 and 1990 and had been on death row for over a decade. In the interview, Wuornos spoke about her troubled childhood, her experiences on the streets, and her claims that she had taken the lives of her victims in self-defense. Throughout the interview, Wuornos appeared to be agitated and emotional, frequently interrupting Broomfield and expressing her frustration with the legal system. She also spoke about her religious beliefs and her hope for forgiveness from God, but maintained that she did not regret her actions. She continued to shift the blame onto others for her actions. She claimed that she was a victim of society and that her crime spree was a result of her being abused and abandoned, and she said that she was sabotaged by the cops and society. She further explained how she wasn't given a fair trial and investigation. Despite her attempts to blame others, Wuornos ultimately accepted responsibility for her actions. 8. Tommy Lynn Sells. Tommy Lynn Sells was a hardened serial criminal who admitted to taking several lives, although the exact number is unknown. Born in Oakland, California in 1964, Sells had a troubled upbringing marked by physical abuse by his mother's partners. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade and became homeless. Sells started committing crimes at a young age, including burglary and assault, before escalating to murder. Over the next 2 decades, Sells traveled across the United States, committing a series of gruesome crimes. His victims belonged to all age groups, from infants to the elderly. He was finally apprehended in 1999 when he attacked and attempted to take the life of a 10-year-old girl in Texas. Sells was interviewed by law enforcement and media multiple times while in custody. During the interview, Sells showed a complete lack of remorse for his crimes and even made jokes about them. He admitted to enjoying the power he felt over his victims. Sells argues that he took the lives of children to put them out of their misery after taking the lives of their mothers. He felt a rush after committing the crime, a feeling of power over others, and a sense of satisfaction and enjoyment. Sells exhibited arrogance during the interview, boasting that he was better at lying than the police and considered himself a con man. He claimed that his troubled childhood, which involved physical abuse by his mother and stepfather, fueled his desire to inflict pain on others. Sells also acknowledged that his substance and alcohol use contributed to his violent tendencies. When asked about the reasons for his actions, Sells simply replied that it was something he wanted to do. He did not express any remorse or regret for his actions. The interview revealed a deeply disturbed individual who exhibited a complete lack of empathy for his victims. Despite his admission of guilt, Sells remained unapologetic for his actions and seemed to revel in his notoriety as a serial killer. Number 9. Dane Downs. Diane Downs is an American woman who was convicted of taking the life of her daughter and then attempted to do the same to her 2 other children. She is considered by some to be a serial killer due to her repeated acts of violence against her own children. Born in 1955 in Arizona, Diane Downs grew up in a troubled household. Her parents divorced when she was young, and her mother remarried a man who was reportedly physically and emotionally abusive towards her and her siblings. Despite her turbulent upbringing, Downs was considered to be an intelligent and outgoing person, and she went on to attend Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College in California. In 1973, Downs married Steve Downs, and the couple had 3 children together. However, their marriage was reportedly rocky, and Diane began having affairs with other men. In 1983, she filed for divorce and moved with her children to Oregon. It was in Oregon that Downs committed the heinous crimes. On the night of May 19, 1983, she drove her 3 children to a remote location and shot them all at point-blank range. Her 7-year-old daughter, Cheryl, died at the scene, while her other 2 children, Christy and Danny, were severely injured but survived. Downs claimed that a stranger had attempted to carjack her and had shot her children, but the police quickly became suspicious of her story. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Downs had a motive for wanting to harm her children. She was obsessed with a man named Robert Knickerbocker, who had made it clear that he was not interested in a serious relationship with her because she had children. Downs reportedly believed that if her children were out of the way, she could pursue a relationship with Knickerbocker. In an interview in 1984 with Ann Yeager, she told how she was haunted by the memories but still continued to smirk slowly. Downs was eventually arrested and charged with taking the life of her daughter and attempting to take the life of her 2 other children. At her trial, the prosecution presented evidence that included Downs's strange behavior both before and after the shootings, as well as her history of lying and manipulation. In 1984, she was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. While Downs' crimes were horrific, what is perhaps even more disturbing is the fact that she has continued to maintain her innocence over the years. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, she has insisted that she did not harm her children and that the real perpetrator is still out there. In a 2010 interview, she even claimed that her surviving daughter had shot her and her siblings. Number 10. Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper, also known as the co-ed killer, is an American serial criminal who was active in California during the 1970s. He was born on December 18, 1948 in Burbank, California, and had a difficult childhood. Kemper was tall and physically imposing, standing at 6 and 9 inches and weighing over 300 pounds, which made him an intimidating presence. Kemper's criminal activity began in 1964 when he shot his grandparents at their home in California. He was just 15 years old at the time, and his motive for the crime was later attributed to the abuse and neglect he suffered from his family. After the shooting, Kemper was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and was sent to a mental hospital, where he remained until he was released in 1969. Kemper's crime spree began in May 1972 when he picked up 2 hitchhiking college students, Mary Ann Pesce and Anita Lucchesa. He brought them to a remote area where he shot and strangled them. Kemper then dismembered their bodies and scattered the remains around the Santa Cruz area. Over the next year, Kemper took the lives of 6 more women, including his own mother and her friend, and engaged in acts of necrophilia with their bodies. In April 1973, Kemper turned himself into the police and confessed to all of the crimes. He was found guilty of 8 counts and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kemper showed no remorse for his crimes and often talked openly about the details of his crimes with the police and psychologists. In fact, he enjoyed discussing his crimes, even providing detailed explanations of his motivations and thought processes. During an interview in 1984, he was asked how a man that looked so normal could commit such a crime, to which he said he was normal. He further explained that the energies, both positive and negative, forced him to commit crimes. He blamed all his actions on his mother and said with tears in his eyes that just because of one mother, those people died. Kemper's psychological profile is a fascinating one. He was diagnosed as a psychopath and exhibited many classic traits of the disorder, such as a lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and a grandiose sense of self-importance. His fixation on his mother and the violence he directed towards women is also indicative of a classic Oedipus complex.